From the people that brought you Turrican comes Rendering Ranger R2, a rare run-and-gun shooter from the 1990s that never came to America. That is, until now. An explosive mix of Contra and Gradius, this stylish action game represents the last gasp of the 16-bit era, back when pre-rendered graphics were all the rage. But is this long-lost shooter a hidden gem, or is it something that should have just stayed buried? That's what we're about to find out when I review Rendering Ranger R2 Rewind. First released back in 1995 on the Super Famicom, Rendering Ranger R2 rode the wave of pre-rendered side-scrollers popularized by the success of Donkey Kong Country. Much like Sega's similarly pre-rendered hero Vector Man, the titular Rendering Ranger is a run-and-gun hero fighting through a post-apocalyptic hellscape. What sets this game apart from pretty much every other run-and-gun shooter on the market is that it will occasionally shift from action platforming stages to lengthy shoot-'em-up levels that resemble games like Gradius and R-Type. There is a story here about the Rendering Ranger, a Special Forces soldier who's on a mission to defend Earth from an alien invasion. In other words, it's Contra with pre-rendered graphics and a life bar. It was actually developed by Rainbow Arts, who had previously sharpened their teeth on the Turrican franchise. In fact, the designer responsible for Rendering Ranger, Manfred Trans, was also the director of Turrican, so fans of that classic platform shooter will feel right at home taking out the alien horde. Now, as a run-and-gun shooter, Rendering Ranger gets most of the fundamentals right. It features a large, glossy hero who runs from left to right shooting down space invaders and upgrading several different weapons, all of which you can switch between at a push of a button. What's nice is this game isn't always a linear affair, as there's a fair amount of exploration in some of the bigger stages. You may need to investigate a factory or a large building full of elevators and dead ends. I mean, it's not quite at the level of a Metroidvania or even Turrican, but the level designs tend to be a little bit more complicated than what you might find in your average Contra game. Rendering Ranger is seen these days as a bit of a cult classic, due in large part to it never getting released outside of Japan, where it only sold around 10,000 copies. If you want to call this a hidden gem, then go right on ahead. But this is not one of my favorite run-and-gun shooters. It pales in comparison to the side-scrolling games of that era, like Gunstar Heroes and Contra III. A lot of this has to do with some of the annoying gameplay decisions that hurt the overall game. A great example of that is that there's just no way to stand in place and shoot in different directions. If you want to shoot in a diagonal, then prepare to run forward or backward. That's annoying. Speaking of running, I found that our hero runs a little bit too close to the right of the screen. Normally, you want the character to be back a little bit, since a majority of the bad guys and obstacles will be coming from the right side. This leads to a lot of annoying cheap hits, which can really add up in the later levels. Now, this is not a problem when it comes to the shoot-'em-up sections of the game, which are a real standout. Once you're flying around in your outer space jet fighter, you can freely move around the screen wherever you want to go, which is really nothing new to the genre. What is unique is your ship's ability to turn around, aiming all of your bullets backwards. This is honestly great, because the game has enemies coming at you from both sides of the screen, and flipping your ship around gives you a fighting chance. And let me tell you, if you've played the original Super Famicom version from the 1990s, then you already know that Rendering Ranger is tough. Even if you boost your lives up to 7, there's no continues, forcing players to memorize the stages through multiple playthroughs. The nice thing is this brand new Rewind package has gone out of its way to alleviate some of this frustration by adding a couple of extremely helpful quality of life upgrades. For one thing, you can now save at any point, including the middle of a level. And as the title suggests, we're actually able to rewind time, allowing players to take another stab at some of the tougher sections. This update also includes the typical extras that you normally get from this style of retro game package, including various borders, screen options, filters, and so on and so forth. There's also a music player and a museum where you can look up the box art and read the instruction manual. This is all fairly standard stuff, but it's certainly appreciated. Honestly, the best new addition is Targa, which is the original version of Rendering Ranger. You see, back before it got a pre-rendered facelift, the game was going to be called Targa. It was going to be more in line with Contra and Turrican when it comes to the pixel graphics. While it looks like there's still some pre-rendered enemies and designs that were probably used to complete this version of the game, Targa does feel like a different experience and has its own pros and cons. It wouldn't surprise me if there are actually people out there that prefer Targa over the more polished Rendering Ranger. I just wish this package did a better job of explaining these two versions of the game. This needs an interview with Manfred Trenz, or just a historical blurb that puts everything into context. Look, as a package, Ziggurat has done a good job of giving Rendering Ranger R2 a second life. As a champion of game preservation, I love that we're finally able to play this game without requiring to go into debt. That said, I'd argue that Rendering Ranger has not aged particularly well, and this package is more compelling for its history than its gameplay. I mean, it's fun, but not a 16-bit essential. Genre fans who've been waiting 30 years to get their hands on this late-generation 16-bit shooter are in luck, because Rendering Ranger R2 Rewind is a loving package that does an excellent job of bringing the action game to a whole new audience. By mixing run-and-gun gameplay with traditional shoot-'em-up sections, this long-lost classic manages to stand out, even if it never quite hits the same heights as Contra III or Gunstar Heroes. I may have some issues with the gameplay and the design decisions, but Rendering Ranger R2 Rewind is a great re-release of a so-so action game. Hey, thanks for watching my review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite run-and-gun shooter? Look, I have a hunch that Contra and Gunstar is going to come up a bunch here, but who knows? Maybe this Rendering Ranger game will be your top pick, and I just don't get it. Let me know in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back later this week with a review of Shadow of the Orient, so definitely be on the lookout for that. While you wait, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,